They said he was the kind of man who didn't speak much, but when he did, even the wind stopped to listen. His name was Elias Boone, a ranch hand who had seen more dust than daylight and more sorrow than any man should. Folks around the San Pedro Valley said he had the heart of a wolf, quiet, loyal and dangerous when cornered. But what they didn't know was that beneath that weathered skin and cold stare lived a heart that still believed in something sacred, life itself. The day it all happened, the sun was a ruthless fire above the canyon ridge. The air trembled with heat. The land smelled of sagebrush and danger. Elias was out riding along the dry riverbed, searching for strays that had wandered too far from the Boone Ranch. He had no idea that before the sun would set, he'd be staring death right in the eye and making a choice that would change his life forever. It began with a cry, faint, sharp, carried by the wind like a prayer lost in the desert. He pulled the reins, his stallion Dustfire snorting as if sensing trouble. Elias lifted his hat to shield his eyes and scanned the rocky slope. The cry came again, this time softer, broken by pain. And that's when he saw her, an Apache woman, barely conscious, lying half-hidden beneath a fallen mesquite tree. Her hand trembled, clutching her ankle, and just beside it lay the twisted remains of a rattlesnake, still coiled, still twitching. The fangs had already done their work. The flesh around her ankle was swelling, turning the color of dusk. Elias jumped down before he even thought about it. The Apache in the ranches had lived in an uneasy truce for years, peace that could shatter with one wrong move. But in that moment, all he saw was a life slipping away, and something deep inside him, older than fear, stronger than pride, told him that no matter who she was, he had to save her. He knelt beside her, his voice low and steady. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, dark as the canyon night. She tried to speak, but her lips barely moved. The venom was already spreading fast. Elias ripped a strip from his shirt, tied it tight above the bite, and without hesitation pressed his mouth against the wound, drawing out the poison like he'd seen his father do once when a boy got bit near the ranch. The taste was bitter, death itself. He spat it out into the sand again and again until the bleeding slowed. The woman's breathing steadied slightly, but she was weak. He could feel her pulse fading beneath his fingers. Elias lifted her gently into his arms, the weight of her small frame both fragile and fierce. "Hold on," he whispered. "Don't you dare leave now." The ride back to the ranch was a race against the dying sun. Dustfire galloped through the canyon, hooves striking sparks off the stone. Every second counted. Elias could feel her heartbeat faltering against his chest. He talked to her, as if words alone could fight death. Told her about the ranch, the old oak tree by the river, the stars that looked like silver dust spilled across the sky. Anything to keep her tethered to the world. By the time they reached the Boone Ranch, the horizon was bleeding orange. He laid her down in the shade of the porch, shouting for water, herbs, anything. Old Mary, the housekeeper, came running, her hands trembling when she saw the marks on the woman's leg. "Elias," she whispered, "she's Apache." "I know," he said quietly, "but right now she's just human." They worked through the night, crushing herbs, cooling the fever. Elias never left her side. When she woke briefly, she looked at him, with eyes that held centuries of pain and strength. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracked and soft. "Why would you save me?" Elias didn't answer. He just stared at the firelight flickering in her eyes and said, "Because no one deserves to die alone out here." Days passed. The fever broke. Slowly she began to heal. Her name was Taya, meaning the wind that brings change. She told him about the snake, how she'd been gathering herbs by the river when it struck. She told him about her people, her tribe living deep in the canyonlands, and the uneasy peace they held with the ranchers. But as she spoke, something else began to bloom between them, something dangerous and unspoken, a bond forged in pain and courage. Elias tried to fight it. He knew what the valley would say if they saw an Apache woman at his ranch. But every time she smiled, that quiet, grateful smile, he felt something thaw inside him, something he thought he'd buried long ago beside the graves of his parents. He found himself listening for her laughter, watching the way her hands brushed against the wildflowers near the porch. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, she stood by the fence watching the horses run. Elias walked up beside her. "You should be heading home soon," he said softly. "I know," she replied, eyes on the horizon. "But when I go, I will remember the man who didn't see an Apache or a ranch enemy, only a life worth saving." He wanted to say something, anything, but words failed him. The silence between them was heavy with everything they couldn't say. That night, as Elias sat alone by the fire, he heard hoofbeats approaching. 3 riders, hard faces, rifles across their saddles. Local men, bounty riders who didn't take kindly to Apaches roaming near white settlements. One of them spat and said, "Boone, we heard you got yourself a snake-bit Apache woman hiding up here. That true?" Elias rose slowly, eyes cold. "Ain't nobody hiding here. You boys best be on your way." But they didn't move. "You know the rules, Boone. Anyone helping an Apache pays the same price." "We ain't letting her walk away." The words hit like thunder. Elias's jaw tightened. He stood tall, dust clinging to his boots, the firelight cutting across his weathered face. "She's not going anywhere tonight," he said. "And you ain't stepping 1 foot closer to my porch." For a moment, the night held its breath. Then one of the riders smirked. "You're making a big mistake, Boone." Elias didn't flinch. "I already did. I waited too long to stand for what's right." The men turned their horses and rode off into the dark, their laughter echoing in the distance. But Elias knew they'd be back, with more guns and more hate. And when they came, he'd have to choose again, between safety and honor, between silence and courage. He sat outside her room all night, rifle across his knees, watching the stars fade into dawn. The land was quiet, too quiet. The wind carried the scent of rain and danger. And somewhere deep in the canyons, the Apache drums began to beat, low and distant, like the sound of an approaching storm. When the dawn came, it came quietly, like a whisper before a storm. Elias Boone stood on his porch, watching the sky burn with streaks of gold and crimson. His eyes were tired, but his heart was steady. He knew what was coming. He could feel it in the air, heavy and electric, like the stillness before lightning strikes. Inside, Taya was awake, sitting by the window. The swelling in her leg had gone down, but the pain in her heart was growing heavier by the hour. She knew what he had done for her, what he had risked. To save an Apache woman in rancher country was no small thing. It was an act of defiance, and acts like that didn't go unpunished. She looked out at Elias, that lone figure framed by the morning sun, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Trust. He had no reason to help her, no promise of reward. Yet he did. In his silence, in his rough hands and steady gaze, she saw something pure, the rare kind of courage that stands alone when the world turns its back. Elias turned and met her eyes through the window. "You should be ready," he said quietly. "They'll come today." Taya's voice trembled. "Then let me go, Elias. I can make it back to my people. If they find me here, they'll kill you." He shook his head. "You can't ride yet, and even if you could, they'd hunt you down before you reach the canyon. You stay here till I say otherwise." She wanted to argue, but there was something in his tone, that same calm, unshakable strength that had pulled her back from death itself. So she said nothing. She just watched him load his rifle, his movements slow and deliberate, the way a man does when he's already made peace with what's coming. By noon, the sound of hoofbeats rolled across the valley, low, distant, and angry. Elias looked up and saw them, 6 riders, dust trailing behind like smoke. They rode hard and mean, their faces carved by sun and hate. At their lead was Cole Matthews, a man who once worked the same land as Elias, until greed turned his heart to stone. He'd been waiting for a chance to break the uneasy truce with the Apache, and now he had his excuse. "Boone!" Cole shouted as they neared the gate. "We heard you got something here that don't belong on white man's land." Elias stepped down from the porch, rifle resting in his hands but not raised. "Ain't no man's land, Cole, it's God's land, and she belongs to life, same as you or me." Cole spat in the dirt. "You talk like a preacher, Boone, but this valley don't run on sermons. You know the law. You help an Apache, you hang. Elias's eyes didn't waver. Then maybe it's time somebody changed that law. The men laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laughter that carries warmth. It was sharp, cruel, the kind that smells of blood. Cole motioned toward the house. We're taking her. You can step aside, or you can go down with her. Elias's jaw tightened. His heart was pounding, but his voice was steady as a river in spring flood. You take one more step past that fence, Cole, and you'll regret it for the rest of your sorry life. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Even the wind seemed to stop breathing. Then Cole's hand went for his gun. The shot echoed through the valley, one clean, thunderous crack. Elias's rifle spoke first. Cole staggered, clutching his arm, the gun clattering to the ground. The others froze, caught between rage and fear. Elias didn't aim again. He just stood there, his voice cutting through the dust. This is my land. You ride any closer, and you'll find out just how serious I am about protecting what's right. The men hesitated. They hadn't expected him to stand his ground like that. But hate runs deep and pride runs deeper. One of them raised his rifle, and the sound of gunfire filled the air. Elias dove for cover behind the old oak barrel, bullets splintering wood and whistling through the porch. He fired back, each shot deliberate, each breath measured. Dustfire, his loyal stallion, neighed and reared as if sharing his master's fury. The smell of gunpowder burned through the afternoon heat. Inside the house, Taya crouched low, her heart hammering. She could hear the bullets, the shouting, the chaos outside, and she knew this was her fault. Every drop of blood spilled out there was for her, and she couldn't bear it. She reached for Elias's spare revolver hanging on the wall, her hands trembling, but her resolve hardening. She had been saved once. Now it was her turn to return that gift. Outside, Elias's shoulder was grazed. He ducked behind the water trough, counting rounds. 4 left. Then he heard it, the creak of the door behind him. "Taya!" he shouted. "Stay inside!" But she didn't listen. She stepped out into the open, limping but unbroken, her dark hair wild in the wind. She raised the revolver and fired. One of the riders cried out and tumbled from his horse. Another turned in shock, losing focus, and Elias's next bullet dropped him clean. Cole cursed, holding his bleeding arm. "You think you can stand against us both?" He yelled. "You're a fool, Boone!" Elias stepped forward, his eyes burning like cold fire. "Maybe I am. But I'd rather die a fool than live as a coward." The remaining men hesitated. They hadn't come for a fight that smelled like justice. Slowly, one by one, they turned their horses and rode off, their pride bleeding more than their wounds. Only Cole lingered, glaring back with hate that could eat through steel. "This ain't over," he spat. "You just made yourself an enemy of every man in this valley." Elias's reply was quiet. "Then every man in this valley needs to find his soul again." Cole rode off into the distance, his shadow long against the dying sun. The valley fell silent once more. Elias turned to Taya, her hands still trembling from the recoil. "You shouldn't have come out," he said softly. She smiled weakly. "You risked your life to save mine. I couldn't let you stand alone." He took the revolver from her, setting it aside, and looked at her with a mixture of pride and pain. "You got more courage in you than most men I've known." That night the ranch was quiet. The fire crackled softly inside as Elias wrapped his shoulder. Taya sat across from him, her eyes glistening in the dim light. "I will leave at dawn," she said finally. "Your people will not stop coming. I cannot bring more trouble to your home." Elias looked into the flames. "You think I saved you to see you vanish into the dark again? No, you stay until you can ride strong. Then I'll take you myself, safe to your people." She stared at him, tears tracing the dust on her cheeks. "They will not accept you. You are a white rancher." He smiled faintly. "I don't need them to. I just need you to live." When dawn broke, they rode together, not as enemies, not as strangers, but as two souls bound by something deeper than blood or name. The desert stretched wide and endless before them, the wind carrying whispers of stories yet to be told. When they reached the canyon ridge, Taya turned to him. "Elias Boone," she said, her voice trembling, "you have given me more than life. You have given me hope that not all hearts are hardened by hate." He nodded. "And you've given me reason to believe there's still goodness in this world." even in places where it's been buried. They stood there in silence, the sunrise painting their faces in gold. Then she rode down into the canyon back to her people. Elias watched her until she became nothing but a shadow in the morning mist. And when he turned back toward his ranch, he carried something with him, not sorrow, not loss, but peace. Weeks later, word spread across the valley. Folks said the Apaches had sent gifts, tokens of gratitude left by the riverbank. A carved feather, a woven bracelet, and a piece of deer hide marked with a single word in their tongue, brother. Elias Boone never spoke much about what happened that day, but sometimes when the sun set, behind the mountains and the wind carried the sound of distant drums, he'd lift his hat to the horizon and whisper, "You're welcome, Tyre." And though time moved on and the valley forgot, the land remembered. The trees, the river, the wind, they all carried that story, a true Western tale of courage. A tale about a man who risked his life not for fame, not for glory, but for something far greater, humanity.